Dundee, in all its glory, has taken 35 plus episodes to build. The neighbouring city on the other side of the bay will not have the same treatment. I'm planning to smash out the majority of the builds in less than 10 episodes. So how am I planning to do that? Well, the houses in Dundee's neighbourhoods were all placed individually. But for the other side of the bay, I'm planning to zone up that bad boy. Problem is, the terrain over this side is pretty ridiculous, and we don't have a huge amount of space to work with. It's its own city, but it's still part of Dundee. We'll get to the naming further on in this episode. For now, let's dive in and start figuring out how this thing's going to take shape. So not only is the terrain over here very tricky to work with, but it's also a pretty unusual shape. We figured out where the main roads are going to go. They're heading in the most logical direction. We've got highway connection, which is off to the left-hand side, and then we've got another two roads. We've got one heading towards the little town of Paterson. We've got one going through downtown. And then we've got three connections over to Dundee. So we've got our Anzac Bridge heading through downtown across the highway. We've got a smaller bridge. And then we've got a windy road that's going to be heading through some suburbs. I got a little bit of an idea of the layout of this because I've got to be very particular with how this is going to take shape. And I'm going to be sharing that a little bit later on in this episode. But for now, we are diving into the road layout for the downtown. Now, I'm calling it downtown. It's not really downtown. I would say downtown would be over on the other side of the bridge in Dundee, whereas this is a secondary skyline for our city. As you can see, we've got some crazy terrain doing some crazy things that we need to iron out and make a little bit better. So I'm using no controller here to smooth out some of these intersections that are causing the most amount of dramas. And then around the highway, I'm just raising it up just a little bit more because the highway is a sunken highway, so we can raise it up just a little bit more. My preferred method is to drag out the roads first and then fix it up using Move It and no controller. And while we're fixing up these roads, removing some of the crossings on some of the intersections here. We don't need crossings on every intersection, particularly not on the alleys, which is something that the motorists will thank me for, but probably not the pedestrians. And speaking of the motorists, with the highway already established, I needed to show that the highway has disrupted our downtown layout and has demolished some of these roads. So I am dragging out a road across the highway and then I'm demolishing it so that I can still see where that road used to connect. It gives me a good idea of the disruption from the highway and to show a little bit of its destructive path. In most cases in Australia, the highway generally comes after the road layouts for these areas, these suburbs, have already been established, unless it is built around some sort of new development, but generally when it stretches through places like this, it has completely disrupted and destroyed parts of the original neighbourhoods. Aspects like that of the city's history always fascinates me and is part of the reason why I like playing this game. I continued to tackle some tricky landscape, trying to think about where these roads would have been built if this was built in a real life city. Lucky for me, I'm building this city based on the city that I live in, so all I have to do is think about every time that I have to walk up a ridiculously big hill, or the amount of times that I was lost trying to navigate on these roads. Unlucky for the people of Dundee, they're going to have to deal with the same first world problems as I do. I continue to drag out the roads in every which way. It might look a little bit random, but I'm essentially trying to figure out where the main roads are going to sit. And then from there, I'm dragging off the smaller roads and the streets and the alleys and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much the technique that I'm going for. Finding the main roads, I'm trying to drag them along areas that make the most amount of sense, giving access to the smaller streets as I start to think about where those smaller streets are going to go and trying to follow the contours of the land, which are proving to be pretty tricky. And then some roads are just dragged out for fun. So for instance, this one that snakes its way down the mountain, I'm pretty much only dragging that out because I think it looks kind of cool, so that's why it's there. With the main roads established, I can start figuring out where some of these streets are going to sit, and I'm starting to think about what sort of zoning I'm going to do and how each neighbourhood's going to look. The problem with zoning in City Skylines is that you don't have a huge amount of control with how things are going to look, unless you use a couple of mods, which I plan to do, whereas with placing down buildings manually, you have complete control. It just takes a really long time, but it might be the only method, especially looking at the types of zoning options we have here because we don't even really have a perfect grid. It might not even be an option to zone, so we'll just have to wait and see. By the way, if you're thinking, hey, don't you already know what happens at the end of this episode? I actually don't. I haven't even recorded the whole episode yet. I'm recording this commentary before I've even finished it, so this could actually be a total flop. I'll push on to a new neighbourhood, going with a completely different style. We're going with a very modern neighbourhood with some good old-fashioned curvy roads, some big lots, and lots of cul-de-sacs. The previous neighbourhood, I'm going to be using some more historical houses from New Zealand, whereas this neighbourhood is going to feature more modern types of houses. I continue to struggle with the terrain, which then reminds me of the reason why I've started a new series based on Miami. Grids in the flattest state in the US sounds pretty good right now. After a little bit of up and down with Move It, I'm then able to smooth out the landscape, giving us a little bit more options when it comes to zoning. I'll push on to the task of making these cul-de-sacs, which is actually pretty easy using the node controller mod. I start by creating a tiny network at the ends of these streets. Using node controller, I then select that node and stretch it out to about 200%. It doesn't really matter how big you go, and all of these are pretty different, but it's a pretty useful way to create these cul-de-sacs. The only thing is, you can't actually zone on these ends, so I'll have to place down buildings there manually. I then give the same treatment to the historical neighbourhood. Of course, this one doesn't have quite as many cul-de-sacs, but there's still a few around. And it was at this point that I realised that I should probably have a bit of a think about how this city was going to expand, what this area was going to look like, where the zoning was going to sit. So I decided to leave the game and jump into good old-fashioned Procreate. I'm using Procreate here to figure out where the zoning is going to sit for this area. Because we don't have the largest amount of space, it is pretty important to figure that stuff out early. Just definitely saves a lot of time because it's nothing worse than building something in City Skylines and then having to completely change it up. I'm starting with the residential zoning because this is going to be the bulk of it, and then we are going to be figuring out where the commercial is going to sit. Because basically the residential is based around the commercial districts, so I am kind of needing to do the residential first, being the largest area, and then we can start figuring out where the commercial districts are going to sit, and the residential is basically going to be centered around it. Adding in the commercial now, and like I said, it's all pretty much in the middle sections with some other little pockets of commercial off into some other areas. We've got an intersection up there with some commercial, and then another little pocket where I'm thinking that, I don't know, maybe some sort of train station might sit there too, which I think would make a bit of sense. And then also adding in some of the other zoning, such as offices. They are going to be sitting pretty close to the Anzac Bridge, which is going to be a bit of a secondary skyline. So I'm sort of thinking about what's going to sit around there to form a bit of a skyline. I think some offices will look quite nice. And of course, being high density, that is also going to work really nicely with these main roads that we have, but then also this highway that's going to be pretty close. But it does mean that we'll have to start thinking about public transport options, because I do think there's going to be a lot of people working and living out this way, particularly with the types of zoning that I'm going for. You know, if this is going to be a lot of higher density apartments and also commercial, and even these office blocks I think are going to be high density, then we're going to have to start figuring out what the sort of public transport options are going to be like. And there's not going to be a huge amount of industry out this way. I'm sort of trying to keep it fairly away from the residents, but then also close to the highways, close to the train line and the main roads. So I think out in that area is going to be probably the best fit. I think it's far enough away from the residents. And then with the zoning all figured out, it's a matter of figuring out where some of the services are going to sit. So I'm using white to place down where I think I'm going to be placing the services, such as schools and police stations and all that sort of stuff that's going to provide all those good things for the people that live out this way, and also parks, which I'm thinking is going to occupy a big chunk of the coastline and this bay area too. And with that, I've got a pretty good idea of how this area is going to take shape, so I can jump back into game and start working on how this place is going to, well, actually come together. With a better idea of zoning, I dived back in to start placing down the first commercial district. This is going to be a very simple, very stock standard commercial district found in Australia. Pub in the corner, a couple of row buildings, other stuff, etc. I'm not really sure why I started listing things in a commercial district, and then I just gave up after 2. With some of the commercial buildings down, I wanted to start placing down some of the service buildings so that we could start increasing some of the land value in this area and also providing people with the services that they need. I started with a school, but the area that I chose was just proving to be a little bit difficult with the terrain, so I decided to shift it down just 1 block and chose an area that was, probably a little bit more complicated to use, but I felt like I had a little bit more space to play with. I ended up splicing 2 of the primary schools together, and then I wanted to create a bit of a tiered and multi-layered playing field for the students to play on, using this soccer field and the terrain network for the top section, And then for the bottom, it's just going to be a playground and a couple of paths, but really just an open field and a bit of space, because I felt like I didn't really have a huge amounts to play with in this area, so I kept it fairly simple. And with the school down, I decided to take care of some of the other services: fire, police station, and death care, and some other bits and pieces, keeping it pretty close to the commercial district, but also making sure that we have a pretty decent spread that goes out towards some of the surrounding suburbs. And some extra bits and pieces to the commercial district, some parking, and some different types of commercial. It was then time to start planning out where some of the districts are going to sit, because this is going to play the important part of determining what each district is going to look like. Thinking about where each district is going to go and the names of these places, one of the names that I added was Hampshire Bay, which was a name suggestion from last week. And the idea is that this area was known for the manufacturing of hemp seed and exporting from a small port. But these days, the manufacturing is no longer there, but the port is being converted into a marina, and the surrounding is now a commercial district, which we'll have to build up in the next episode. But I always like a bit of backstory when it comes to building these areas. It just helps to get an idea of the history behind some of the places that we're building. Some of the other names include Yarramundi, which was the name of an Aboriginal leader, and we've also got Matilda Point, which is the neighbouring city across the bay from Dundee. Even though this whole area is still going to be known as Dundee, Matilda Point is going to be a bit of a secondary skyline. And then it wouldn't feel like an Australian city if we didn't have at least one ridiculous name for a place. I'm sure this is the same in other countries, but I feel like there are so many unusual names for places within Australia. For example, I remember driving past somewhere that was called Tumbledown Dick Hill, which basically sounds like someone's fallen down the hill and then decided to call the hill named after that incident. And then when I used to live out of Bathurst, there was a place that I used to drive past all the time called Neapolitan Reef, which, I mean, honestly sounds pretty amazing, but I remember driving off the highway and just checking out what the place was like, and it was just a couple of shacks and a dirt road and just a couple of paddocks, so really not living up to that amazing name at all. But, I mean, I guess I wasn't really expecting a reef, but why call it Neapolitan Reef? It's really misleading. But anyway, back to City Skylines. I'm starting to use building themes mods to select the types of buildings that I want to be spawned in this area. I said that this is going to be a pretty historical New Zealand inspired area, so I'm choosing a bunch of these super pretty houses that are made by Seabud, and they're really decorated and looking really nice. So I'm using them, which are going to be spawning in that area. But then for this modern area, we are choosing some more modern styles of housing. These are in my asset collection, they're called boomer houses. But the problem is that they only spawn at, I think, probably like level 3 or level 4. I think there's a bit of a mix, but it means that I have to choose a lot of other houses that are going to be a bit of placeholder until this area has higher land value, and then we'll start seeing those houses being spawned. Whereas the historical neighborhood, they are all level 1 buildings, and I have basically just made it so that it's all historical. So they stay historical and they don't change, but the land value in that area and the leveling up of those houses will continue to happen. And with that, I start to drag out some power lines and start connecting this area up to the main power grid and water grid, and providing all the things that it might possibly need to start spawning and start growing. I am starting to zone, and I am disabling some of the zoning options on some of these houses or some of these lots, just because, well, I've got some funny angles, but then also I don't really want to see that many houses being built on these corners. You don't really see that. Your houses are usually built either opposite each other or, kind of all on the same road. And with the roads all sorted, I can start zoning up this area. But you can see, we don't have perfect lots. It's the real challenge with creating or doing zoning like the game intends when you're not creating perfect grids. My grids are completely all over the place, but that's staying pretty true to the, at least Sydney way. And with the city all zoned up, it was now time to hit play and watch people begin to move in. And I was honestly pretty impressed with the way that buildings started to spawn in this area. I did not expect it to look as nice as it did. We had some buildings really nice and flush against each other, and ones right up against the corner of the roads. For a place that doesn't exactly have the most standard of grids, it ended up working pretty well. But of course, there are areas that do need to be fixed up. So we do have a land value issue where we don't really have very nice land value in this area over here, Yarramundi. So we needed to increase that at some point so that we could start seeing the right houses starting to be spawned. But then also some corners that don't really have any zoned areas, just because they were, the corners were too weird and too awkward that I couldn't really zone in those areas. So I'm going through now and placing down buildings manually, and the way this works is every time I place down a building, it ends up being a historical building, and it means that it'll stay exactly the way it is, which is great because, I'm placing down buildings intentionally, so I do want them to stay the way they are. And then people move in and they function just the way like other buildings will function, which is quite nice. I mentioned earlier that buildings do not spawn on these cul-de-sacs, so I'm going through and placing buildings on there manually, which is a little bit tedious, but it's definitely not as bad as having to place down an entire neighborhood like this. And I'm also going around and adding in houses manually to places that I, either want buildings to look a particular way, like this corner over here. I wanted this to be a corner, so I'm using these 3 buildings that are all exactly the same and splicing it into that corner. But also, on this cliffside, I wanted there to be more modern houses because, this is prime real estate. This is one of the most beautifulest areas to live. It's not only beautiful location in terms of the views, but also, I think it's got all the services you could ever possibly want, and it's also got, it will be surrounded by parks very shortly, so it's absolutely awesome. So I had to give them some super nice looking houses that really make the most of this cliffside. But also, being a historical neighborhood, not every single house is going to continue that historical look. There are also going to be some modern houses within this area. So I am placing those modern houses in areas that I think fit better. And it gives this cool look because it's kind of this mix between historical, but then we've also got this more modern and definitely much larger types of houses as well. The commercial district need a little bit of work, so I'm placing down some Rico buildings here. We've got a couple of larger ones and also a motel just to provide some extra services, and thinking about the land value and thinking about what zoning is needed in these areas, I think that that's something we definitely needed to add. And with the majority of vacant areas now filled, I can go through and start adding in all the trees, which I am going pretty wild with, excuse the pun, just because there is a lot of space, but then also I wanted this area to be fairly bushy. Australia is, well, I am always blown away with just how many trees we have within our neighborhoods. I think we're pretty lucky in terms of that. And, New Zealand's quite similar. Looking at New Zealand, they have a lot of trees in their neighborhoods as well. So, going pretty wild. We're adding in quite a lot. But then in other areas that are a little bit more established, I'm not doing as many. So around that commercial district, we don't have quite as many, and some of the houses around there too, but really around the edge of these neighborhoods, then we've got plenty. So we've got these little valleys with just tons and tons of trees, which just looks super pretty. And with that, I decided it was time to start tackling the land value because we still have a pretty low land value in this area, not really enough parks, so I figured it was time to start surrounding this area with a whole bunch of super pretty parks. I wanted to start with one that was inspired by one in Sydney. This was an area that I had no idea about until a couple of months ago when I did the walk, and it's basically an old industrial site where it was used to hold a bunch of oil. These are big oil tanks that used to sit in this area. But in more recent times, it is being converted into a super pretty park that has some really amazing views of the city. And basically, they've got these old oil tanks, and there's a couple still left, but the grounds, you can still see where some of the old ones used to sit, and they've just been converted into like playgrounds or just places where you can hang out and do things, and it's just cool. It's a cool little industrial area. We've got heaps of these sort of areas within Sydney. Sydney's got like a massive industrial park, especially around a lot of these, these waterways where industry used to mostly sit, and boats used to be the main form of transportation to get industry all around the city. But now these areas are I mean, they're prime real estate. People all want to live in the city, so these areas are being converted into parkland and bushwalks and all sorts of different things. So I decided to do something similar. We've got a couple of tanks still here, and we have this this cliffside that's been kind of cut into, which is again inspired by that area. And just to blend it in, putting a whole bunch of trees, and I am sinking a bunch of these oil tanks low into the ground so you can still see the circle base of these things, which is again inspired by the walk that I did. Then I added in a path and a couple of different park benches and a little playground on one of the old oil tank bases, which I thought was a cool little touch, and turned this whole area into a park. So this is creating more land value for this area, but it's also creating the first little area of parkland because again, there's going to be a lot around the perimeter of the water. We definitely needed more beaches in this bay, and this is the first of many to come. Again, we got so many of these in Sydney, and I figured we needed to create at least a couple of them. So in the next couple of episodes, we're going to be adding in more and more beaches. They're great for adding in extra land value, but most importantly, they just look so nice along this peninsula. I'm also including a little playing field with some parking. There are some facilities and also just a couple of extra little park elements to it, which I think is super nice. And then we're continuing the path that's gonna snake its way around the entire headland. In fact, it's gonna go around all the waterways. Wherever you see this, this cliffside and this tree line as well, that's where there's going to be a pathway. We've got heaps of these in Australia, and they're these areas that you typically forget about. You do a couple of them, and then I don't know, I always find new ones to walk around, and I'm always so impressed with how many we have, and Oceania and Dundee are going to get the same treatment. This is another little area for playing field, and I also decided to add in a little shop down here too. I don't really know what the function is. Maybe it's a fish and chip shop, or maybe it's a hotel, but I think it looks pretty nice down in this corner. I then wanted to extend out the parkland to this whole area, so it is spreading across a huge distance. Like I said, it is a giant parkland, and I'm turning it into a national park. So there are multiple entrances into this way, and it's just got a whole bunch of different walking trails. And I've also placed down a couple of facilities in this area too, but I didn't want to go too overboard. Of course, I'm trying to, the more I add, the more land value for this park. But really, I think that the beauty of this park is just walking along these pathways and exploring this area. So, just adding in some rock climbing. There's some benches down below and some places to stay, and also a couple of little wharves too, which I think make a nice little addition. And as you can see, the land value in this area just absolutely, it's great. It's really nice. This place becomes one of the nicest areas to live within Dundee, and I'd say in Oceania, probably one of my favorite places to live for sure. I'd definitely be a proud resident of Bald Head. But like I said, this area is going to be a bit of a work in progress. We're going to work around some areas that, well, a bit more of the coastline in particular in the next couple of episodes. I won't give too much away, but it's definitely going to be a fun couple of episodes. But for now, guys, thank you all so much for watching today's episode. It is always very much appreciated. I want to give a special shout outs to some of the people who are supporting the channel on Patreon: Gaming Shard, Sleepy Slaff, Thomas Riley, Ricky Killen, Nick Ashab, Ginnister, Nano Phoenix, Sebastian Hasselberg, Axaris, Donglin Lee, Michael Danger, Jim Royster, and Dan W. Thank you guys so much for support, and I'll catch you all in the next one.